In this video, we're going to learn how to create a flying drone that we can control with our keyboard. More specifically, we're going to look at the state machine, the collider component, as well as the rigid body component. Before we get started, let me show you the written tutorial we're going to be looking at. If you go to our tutorials page, you'll find it here. It's called Flying a Drone. I'm going to be following this fairly closely. I'm going to make a few adjustments though. So if you see me deterring a little bit from that written tutorial, don't worry. I'm just making a few minor adjustments. All right, so from the dashboard, let's go ahead and scroll down to the template section and use the default lighting scene template to open up a new scene. And we'll call Flying a Drone. If you already see that I have one, that's because this is not the first time I've done it. All right, so here we are in a scene. We have a sky sphere, which is the blue sky background you see. It's a 360-degree image that's surrounding the entirety of our scene. We also have three different lights. So if you unfold the default lights, you have the three different directionals: a fill, a key, and a rim light. All right, and so that is pretty much all that's in our scene other than the default camera. To get started, we want to create something to represent the ground. And so I'm going to go ahead and click the Create Entity, and I'm going to select this disk. So we'll click Add Disk. With it selected, I'll go ahead and click the F key on my keyboard. It'll zoom in on it. It looks like it's invisible. It's not really. If I move over to this side there, I can see it. Disks operate in such a fashion that you can see them only from one side. That's useful for when you are making rooms or a building that you want to see from the inside, but you also want to see inside it from the outside, if that makes sense. So when you're outside a building, you can see in, but when you're inside, you can't see outside. So that's what they're helpful for those types of situations. So we have a disk. It's not set, the transform values are not set the way we want. So I'm going to open the transform component, and I will change the X rotational value to -90. And also this disk is really only about 1 meter in diameter, so I want to make it a lot larger. So let me back that up. I'm going to click Uniform Scale and then make it 1000. So it's much, much larger now, acting like a ground of some sorts. I also want to change the color of it. It's this fairly light white or fairly light gray, almost white. I want to, if under the material component, I go to color diffuse, I select the color picker, and I'll go to a darker gray. Perfect. All right. Let's go ahead and add the drone now to our scene. So I'll click Import Assets above the Asset Library. And this will bring up a public library that is available to all Sumerian users. And we'll just find the drone. I'll select that and click Add. The drone already has a lot of stuff built onto it, including animations. It is not yet controllable using our keyboard. That's what we're going to add to it. But if I find it down in the Assets panel, remember, whenever I'm adding something from the Assets panel, I want to find the Entity asset type, which always has this little hexagon icons. So when I find that, I can drag that onto my canvas, and it'll appear right there. Perfect. Now what I mean by animations, I'll press play, and you'll see the blades are turning. So that's an animation added to this entity. All right. Now, let's add a component that will then treat this drone to react to gravity. So right now, if we press play, it just floats there, as well as the disk. The disk just floats there. Everything is stagnant. Yes, the blades are turning, the animation is moving, but it's not reacting to gravity of any kind. It's not falling, it's not flying, it's not doing anything, it's just standing there. It's really just a stagnant object. So let's go ahead and press stop and click Add Component. What I want to happen is I want this to fall to the ground and react to gravity, or be more really appropriately, have gravity applied to this entity. So I'm going to click the rigid body. The rigid body component is the component that will treat entities as if they are solid objects that react to gravity. So I will click rigid body, and we'll just leave it as is. I'm going to drag, just because I want to show you something real quick, I'm going to drag it up. We'll press play and see what happens. All right, it falls, but it goes right through this disc. By the way, I do want to, well, I can leave it. I usually call this disc or floor or ground or whatever, so I might use different terms, but the disc. So there are two things we need to do. We need to define this drone as a object that can collide with other solid objects. We also need to add the same thing to the disc so that the drone can collide with it. We need to essentially add a collider to both the drone and the ground so they can run into each other. If you only add a collider to one, it doesn't do anything because the one with the collider component doesn't know that the other one is a solid object, so it'll just go right through it. How do we do this? Let's start with let's actually start with the disk. I'm going to click Add Component and then come down to Collider. It's actually at the top. And because there are different shapes for collider components, and notice as I kind of move around, you see this green wire around it? That's because there's this large box around a very, very large box, about 1,000 units from one side to the other, surrounding this disk. That's not the shape that we want this disk to take. We really want it to be a flat plane is the shape that we want this collider to be in, so we can change the shape from box down to infinite plane. And now you see it more accurately represented as a plane. And so this green wireframe actually will tell you where the collider edges or this collider boundaries actually are represented on that entity. So that's good for the disk. We don't want the disk to fall, so we don't add a rigid body to the disk because we don't want the disk to fall any further because it is the ground. So it is fine the way it is. But the drone, we need to add a rigid body, and we also, which we already have, now we need to add a collider component to this as well. So let's, with the drone selected, we'll then add component and then select collider. And just as I was saying with the disk, we have the collider, the shape of it is this box going around the drone. But it's pretty big. You see how it actually goes a lot lower? So let's click play and see what happens. It falls to the ground, but notice, see, it's still floating above it. That's because, again, the shape of this collider extends beyond the actual entity itself. So how do we fix this? Well, what you want to do is change these half extents. So it usually goes to just roughly around the edge of the boundary of the actual entity itself. So around the X and Y, or the X and Z, it's fine. It extends a little bit beyond it, but for this tutorial, that's fine. But we actually want it to land. We want the drone to actually land on the disk. So let's change the Y value down a little bit. Now really, it can be whatever shape that we want it to be. So I'm just going to make it very narrow so that really what's happening is this small square disc, not disc really, flat box is really the shape of it. That is what's landing on the disc. So technically, the upper half or the majority of the drone right now is not actually treated with a collider. Only just this lower part is. But for this tutorial, that's fine. It works just fine. Okay, so we just added collider components to both the drone and the disk. If you want two objects to be able to collide with each other, they both have to have a collider component added to them. We also have a rigid body connected to the drone because we want it to react to gravity, or again, gravity to be applied to this entity. Gravity doesn't exist in this world. because we don't want the disk to fall either. All right, so now we have some more real world, we have these entities acting like real world objects. Now we need to add the controls so that we can fly this drone using our keyboard. To do that, we need to add a behavior and build that behavior using the state machine. So again, with the drone still selected, I'll click Add Component. I'll come down to the state machine. If you've been watching several of our videos, you'll notice that the state machine is a very, very important component that is important to making any sort of interactivity or behaviors to happen within your scene. So we have state machine component over here, but there are no behaviors yet. We need to click the plus button to start a new behavior. That opens up the state machine. And for this drone to fly upwards and move it sideways, left and right, or front and back, we need to add two behaviors. But we're going to start with the first one, and that's just to fly the drone and make it go up in the air. So what we're going to call this behavior is vertical behavior. Okay, good. And this first state, we are just going to call it no movement. So when you press play, nothing's going to happen. It's just going to sit there. But we want to add an action that will then transition to another state where something will make it fly in the air. So we will click Add Action. And we're going to look for the key up. I take that back. We want the key down. Action. All right. And if you're used to playing video games, the WASD keys, the W, A, S, and D keys are the most common ones to use. So instead of to go up, we don't want it to be the A, though we could. We'll just make it the W key instead. All right, we'll add another state. So now we need to add some action that will actually move this entity up in the air. And we're going to call this new state move up. We'll add action. And the action we want is the apply force on rigid body. And this is really just what it sounds like. It's adding force to a rigid body. And remember, we have a rigid body on here so that it can actually move up in the air. So the direction we want it to go is up. So we're going to add some sort of force value to the Y axis. So we'll make it 15. All right, and then we're going to add action again. And we're going to look for the key up. Action. And we're going to make it W. And now we're going to connect these two states by dragging on the transition label and then dragging an arrow to the other state. So what happens here is when we press play, there's no movement. That's the default. Also, if you have a state selected, you can set it as the initial state. Typically, I always start by the first state I make is almost always the default state. But sometimes it gets messed up, and you have to make that change yourself. So you can always set whatever state you want as the initial state. So what happens here is, I'll go ahead and press play. You notice the no movement is highlighted. It's not transitioning because what it's waiting for is this key down. So as soon as the W key goes down, it transitions over to this move up state. And when it's in this state, it will continuously add force and 15 units or 15 force values and continuously to the drone, so it'll just move straight up in the air. And then it'll transition back to the no movement state when the W key goes up. So when I press the W key, it flies up in the air. And when I release it, it goes back down. You can see the states transitioning from one to the next, and that's based on whether or not I have the W key pressed. So that's how you fly a drone. Great. Now, that's great that we can go up and down, but how do we go left and right? We want to add another behavior and make some changes, or make it similar to this current behavior, but a little bit different. So what we're going to do here is we're first going to copy the current behavior, because again, we don't want to start from scratch. When you're making behaviors, if you can ever reuse a current behavior and then make some adjustments to it, it's great. So what you want to do is duplicate it and then make some adjustments to the new one. So to find our behavior, I see it right here, but just as a heads up, you can always click the filter buttons here to find them very easily. So I'll click the behaviors filter. And there it is, my vertical behavior. I'll click the duplicate button. And then we have vertical behavior 2. I'm going to go ahead and add vertical behavior 2 onto my drone. Notice that just because I duplicated over here in the assets panel, it doesn't apply it to the drone. We have to do that ourselves. So I'll drag it over here. So now we have 2 identical vertical behaviors applied to this. So what we'll do then is just make some edits to the vertical behavior 2. And if you didn't catch that, what I did was I hit the pencil button or the edit icon. That's just how we can get into the state machine. And the first thing we want to do is rename it. It's always helpful to rename your behaviors, because if you have, right now it's very confusing, vertical behavior, but eventually these will do different things and we wouldn't know which is which. So I'll call this horizontal behavior. Great. All right. To get rid of these transitions, the first place we'll start, we'll click the arrowhead of the transitions, and that will get rid of it. So what we want to do, so instead of moving up, we want to add force values that will allow it to move left and right. So the no movement one is fine, except that we want to add one more action, because we want to have 2 options. We want it to be able to go one direction using one key and another direction using the other key. So for this one, instead of W, we want it to be the A key. And then we also want it, so that'll make it go right, or left, I should say. And then we also want to make it go right using the D key. So I'll add an action. And then we need to find the D key down. And I'll make this one D. All right. So the A key, again, will make it go left. And then the D key will make it go right. So let's make the left movement state here. And we already have the apply force on rigid body, but instead of adding force to the Y force value, or having a Y force value, we want to have a X force value. And we'll make it 4. And then the key up action, we want it to match this key down action. So we'll make it A. Good. Now we just need to create an almost identical state, but make it for the opposite, moving in the opposite direction, or the right direction. So I'll duplicate this state. I'll move it over here to keep things easy to see where I'm at. I'll rename it right movement. We'll go -4 instead of +4. And again, we want this to match the D key. The last thing we need to do is then add transitions to their respective states. So the on key down, we want it transition to the left movement, because that's the one that is associated with the A key. And then likewise, we want to bring it back here. For the D key down transition, we want to move it over to the right movement. And then similarly, bring the on key D up back to no movement. So let's see how this works. I'll press play. Now you can't see the vertical movement one, but it's still operating, just even though I don't have that behavior toggled. You can see it. Actually, I can do that real quick. If I just over here in the, you see it, it's transitioning back and forth between the two using the W key. Let's go over to the vertical behavior, or the horizontal behavior, I'm sorry. I'll zoom out a little bit. If I click in, if I'm holding down on the W key to fly it, but then I'm also flying it a little bit using the A key. And then I can go the other direction. Oh, it got all turned around. Let me try that again. See, there it goes. And there it goes, left. So what happens is because it is treated as a physical object, you see how it's actually getting a little bit tilted sometimes? That's because it is a physical object, and so it is hitting in a certain way that's making it kind of almost teeter a little bit based on impact. So it's cool to see some of those physical attributes playing out here like this, and it can. See if we can get it to tip over. It might take a little bit too much work. But that is how you can create a flying drone that can be controlled by your keyboard. Just to review, we used the state machine. We created two different behaviors, the horizontal behavior and the vertical behavior, to both move the drone up and down, and then also left and right using the WASD keys. Well, really not the S key, but the W, A, and D keys. And to do that, we also had to have the rigid body and the collider components applied to both the disc and the drone. Well, the drone only had the rigid body, or the drone had the rigid body and the collider. The disc only had the collider. But that covers it for this tutorial. Please join us in our next one. Thank you.